the formidable Spartan hoplites, the embodiment of unyielding power, stood on the rugged coast of Hellas. Their voices, filled with scorn, echoed over the waves, challenging the graceful Athenian triremes that glided elegantly across the water. At sea, the Athenians reigned supreme, their valiant fleet controlling trade routes and coastlines. But on the sun-baked land, the invincible, deadly Spartan army held sway, their phalanxes capable of crushing any foe. All of Greece bled, plunged into the merciless maelstrom of the Peloponnesian War. Unseen shadows of spies and cold-blooded assassins slipped through the narrow streets of every major city-state, sowing fear and distrust. And the weary urban centers became silent witnesses to a terrifying plague that mercilessly decimated the population, sparing neither noble nor commoner. Then, when it seemed that hope was almost lost, Sparta, in a desperate attempt to turn the tide, would be forced to seek aid from the most sworn and hated enemy of all Hellas. But would this step, this unthinkable alliance, be enough to change the outcome of the great conflict, or would it merely hasten the final collapse? Long before these tragic events, in 550 BC, a development unprecedented in the history of the peninsula occurred on the political map of Greece. Sparta, Corinth, Elis, and Tegea, cities known for their independence and occasional rivalry, united in an unprecedented alliance. This coalition of city-states, proudly calling itself the Peloponnesian League, established control over vast territories in southern Greece, including the strategically vital Peloponnese region, from which it derived its name. Their leaders clearly understood that only through joint efforts could they repel any external aggressors who dared to encroach upon their ancestral lands. Although relations between the members of this league were, at times, extremely tenuous, based more on immediate gain than on deep principles of friendship and mutual understanding, their practical value was undeniable. Nevertheless, in the coming decades, the members of the Peloponnesian League would have to unite in the face of an encroaching, increasingly evident threat that was brewing just beyond their borders, a threat that could change the fate of all Hellas. Sparta, in essence, acted as the undisputed leader of its league, effectively using its power to suppress internal rebellions that regularly arose within its own lands. The warriors of this city-state were known throughout the ancient world for their exceptional precision and deadly tactics, inspiring awe in their opponents. Numerous myths and epics were composed about their valiant deeds, the most famous of which undoubtedly recounts the Battle of Thermopylae. It was there that King Leonidas and his 300 Spartan hoplites heroically gave their lives to slow the rapid advance of Persian soldiers who had invaded Greece. This selfless sacrifice allowed the other Greek city-states to gather their forces and organize a successful defensive strategy. However, in 478 BC, one of the greatest threats loomed over Sparta's dominance. It was at this time that the Delian League began to actively form. Athens, possessing a powerful fleet, sailed east to liberate Greek cities from Persian rule. After successfully freeing vast territories and numerous islands throughout the Aegean Sea, they united with Athens, and the Delian League rapidly transformed into the dominant force in the region. Athens achieved several more significant victories in key battles such as Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea. These triumphs strengthened the unity of the city-states that had allied for mutual defense against any future Persian aggression. The Delian League steadily expanded, gaining ever greater power and influence in the ancient Greek world. More than 300 cities were now under the direct or indirect control of Athens, a testament to their growing hegemony. Thanks to the countless riches flowing in as tribute from the previously liberated territories, and a significantly increased number of warriors, the Athenian power not only equaled Sparta's but perhaps even surpassed it. Their ambitions stretched far beyond existing borders, aimed at expanding their empire and spreading influence throughout Hellas. Athens imposed strict demands on all members of the Delian League, obliging them to pay tribute both in monetary terms and in the form of warships and military contingents. These colossal resources were directed toward intensifying the confrontation with Sparta and its ally, the Peloponnesian League. In the coming years, a series of local clashes would inevitably lead to the outbreak of full-scale war between these two powerful states, in which only one side was destined to achieve ultimate victory. In the period preceding 460 BC, serious disagreements arose between two city-states within the Peloponnesian League. the conflict between Megara and Corinth reached a critical point. Sparta, which traditionally maintained closer relations with Corinth, immediately offered its support. However, Athenian strategists, closely monitoring developments, quickly identified the brewing internal schism within the ranks of the Peloponnesian League and decided to exploit the situation for their geopolitical objectives. The Athenian leadership began actively supporting Megara, pursuing two main goals: either to persuade the city-state to join the Delian League, or, at the very least, to significantly weaken Spartan influence in this strategically important region. As a result, Megara began to forge closer ties with Athens, and this significant shift in the balance of power, of course, did not escape the keen attention of the Spartans. The Athenians, steadily expanding the limits of their influence, now openly claimed territories traditionally belonging to Sparta. At the same time, secret agents operating within the Athenian city-states gradually became a source of serious problems. However, in ancient Sparta, it became clear that, unfortunately for the people of Athens, they lacked an effective information protection system. This is why numerous spies and informants freely reported to the Spartan leadership that Athens was actively investing significant resources in substantially improving its naval capabilities. It was assumed that their naval power would soon become absolutely unrivaled throughout the region. Nevertheless, one specific construction project caused particular concern among the Spartans. Its completion could transform Athens into a virtually impregnable fortress, invulnerable to siege. This referred to the Athenians' construction of their long walls, which connected the city gates of Athens to the vital ports of Piraeus and Phaleron. Athenian leaders were well aware that their powerful fleet inspired awe, and the likelihood of any enemy successfully blockading their ports was extremely low. This meant that even if an enemy army found itself outside the city walls, Athens would still be able to continuously receive vital supplies from Piraeus and Phaleron, using the protected long walls. The construction and large-scale reconstruction of these strategic fortifications served as an unambiguous signal to the Spartans that Athens was actively preparing for full-scale war in the near future. In 460 BC, Athenian forces approached the borders of Corinth, which meant that this city-state could no longer disregard the growing threat from the Delian League. Soon, a series of fierce clashes erupted between Corinth and Athens, officially marking the beginning of the First Peloponnesian War. In response, several members of the Peloponnesian League rushed to Corinth's aid, sending their troops. Sparta, however, chose to remain aloof from the unfolding conflict at that moment. Corinthian warriors and their allies successfully repelled the Athenian assault and ultimately forced them to leave their lands. However, while the Athenian army did not demonstrate such significant success on land, their fleet steadily increased its power and numbers. The Athenians established undisputed dominance over the seas, undertaking a series of successful campaigns to seize islands and coastal cities throughout the Aegean basin. They even dispatched a portion of their fleet to Egypt, seeking to strengthen their position and increase their influence in this strategically important region. Over the next decade, a series of bloody clashes unfolded across Greece as members of the Peloponnesian and Delian Leagues sought to expand their spheres of influence and territorial holdings. Although Sparta had maintained only minimal involvement in the war until then, Athenian forces launched a daring invasion of lands controlled by Sparta. This forced Sparta to increase its involvement in the conflict, and it gradually began to gain the upper hand in land battles across Greece. In 457 BC, the Spartans inflicted a crushing defeat on Athenian forces at Tanagra. Both opposing sides suffered significant losses, and although Sparta's victory was undisputed, it led to both armies choosing to return to their cities rather than continue military operations. During a temporary lull in hostilities, Athens made a diplomatic move, reaching out to Argos, which was traditionally considered one of the most serious threats to Spartan dominance over the Peloponnesian League. This move caused deep concern and put the Spartan leadership on high alert, ready for new challenges. While Sparta closely monitored Argos and the Delian League as a whole, the Athenian fleet launched a series of military operations targeting the coastal areas of the Peloponnese. However, Athens had excessively dispersed its military resources. Their naval and land forces deployed in Egypt were defeated by the Persian army. In 454 BC, the treasury of the Delian League was transferred to Athens, significantly strengthening the city-state's dominant position. This move gave Athens unprecedented control over the League's financial flows, allowing them to invest funds in their own military ventures. After the defeat in Egypt and the subsequent restructuring of the Delian League, Athens reduced the intensity of its military operations within the Peloponnesian League. Seeking to secure sufficient time to implement ambitious plans for forming a naval power, they initiated negotiations for a truce with Sparta. In 446 BC, the so-called 30 Years' Peace Treaty was signed between Athens and Sparta. This period of calm, alas, proved to be significantly shorter than expected. Little more than a decade after the peace agreement was signed, Athens took initial steps that clearly indicated an intention to resume confrontation. Athens consolidated its military resources and established an extremely strict policy of collecting tribute from other member states of the Delian League, as well as from territories under their control. Simultaneously, Athens steadily increased the strength of its land and sea forces. Throughout this period, Sparta increasingly watched with alarm the formation and strengthening of a potential threat emanating from the northeast. In 433 BC, Athens formed an alliance with Corcyra, which was one of Corinth's key colonies. Athens immediately dispatched its military contingents to Corcyra, where combat clashes between Athenian and Corinthian forces quickly erupted. In the following year, 432 BC, Sparta and its allies in the Peloponnesian League officially accused Athens of violating the terms of the 30 Years' Treaty and began actively preparing for full-scale war. Athens again disregarded the terms of the peace agreement when it issued an ultimatum to Potidaea demanding the dismantling of all defensive fortifications. The purpose of this step was to ensure the unimpeded transport of timber and minerals from Thrace to Athens and other territories belonging to the Delian League. However, rejecting these aggressive demands, Potidaea immediately sought aid and protection from Sparta. The Spartan leadership, in turn, immediately expressed its readiness to provide support and take the city under its protection. Despite being fully aware that Potidaea was already under the aegis of the Peloponnesian League, Athens nevertheless proceeded to besiege the city. Soon after, Athens passed the so-called Megarian decrees, establishing a strict prohibition for Megara from using any ports under the control of the Delian League. Such measures effectively amounted to declaring a complete embargo against Megara, with the clear aim of undermining the city's economic power and forcing it to join the Athenian alliance. Given that Megara remained an integral part of the Peloponnesian League, Athens' actions deeply outraged the Spartans. It became evident that Athens was willing to take any steps to assert its undivided dominance over all Hellas. Among Spartan circles, there was a growing realization that such expansion directly threatened their own hegemony, and therefore Athenian aggression had to be stopped at all costs. Sparta, expressing its unwavering will, urgently demanded that Athens immediately revoke the Megarian decrees and restore the previous status quo in the region. However, the Athenian side categorically rejected these demands. Sparta, although not fully ready for a prolonged military conflict at that moment, understood that the time was near, and then Athens would certainly pay a high price for its audacity and defiance. Over the next year, Sparta and its numerous allies accumulated sufficient military forces to confidently counter the might of Athens. They were fully prepared for full-scale military operations, and although the peace treaty was supposed to last for 30 years, it became clear that Athens could no longer be allowed to freely dictate its will and act without regard for possible consequences. A key moment was the treacherous attack by Thebes, a long-time ally of Sparta, on Plataea, a city under the control of the Delian League. Soon after, the Spartan king Archidamus personally led a large-scale invasion of Attica, which officially marked the beginning of the Second Peloponnesian War. The Spartans deeply realized that their previous long disengagement from the First Peloponnesian War had been a serious mistake, and they were determined not to repeat past miscalculations. The full military might of the Peloponnesian League fell upon Athens and its allies. During the Second Peloponnesian War, a new, significantly more destructive paradigm of warfare began to emerge, as this conflict was to definitively determine the future hegemon of all Greece. Before this time, Greek warfare predominantly consisted of clashes between hoplite units operating in a dense phalanx. They formed tight, impenetrable ranks, providing mutual protection with their massive shields and striking with long spears and short swords. However, this traditional strategy was rapidly becoming obsolete, as combined tactics were increasingly being introduced and applied on the battlefields. Hoplites were now integrated into light infantry and cavalry units, opening up new possibilities for more dynamic maneuvers and flanking strategies, invariably resulting in the rout of entire enemy battalions. To meet the colossal manpower needs and ensure the necessary numbers for the two main armies, slaves, mercenaries, and foreign soldiers were actively recruited into their ranks. However, the lack of proper training and years of military upbringing among these new recruits inevitably led to a dramatic increase in casualties among personnel. As more and more untrained soldiers appeared in the ranks, military leaders focused on improving strategic planning to defeat their enemies. Sparta recognized that it possessed unmatched tactical methods and valiant warriors on land, while Athens perfectly understood that its fleet could completely defeat enemy forces at sea and inflict significant blows on coastal settlements. Such a fundamental division of spheres of influence precluded the possibility of a quick and decisive victory for one of the opposing sides over the other. Any triumphant Spartan campaign on land inevitably met with a harsh Athenian response in the form of devastating coastal raids, or the complete destruction of the Peloponnesian fleet. The conflict continued with undiminished intensity, and both sides suffered colossal losses in manpower. Like a perfectly functioning mechanism, Sparta and its allies relentlessly, year after year, raided the city-states of the Delian League, systematically advancing towards Athens itself. The goal of these systematic actions was to inflict maximum damage and sow chaos. Each of these annual campaigns left an indelible trail of devastation and death. The warriors of the Peloponnesian League mercilessly burned vast fields of crops, destroyed defensive fortifications, and sought to create serious disruptions in vital Athenian supply arteries. However, since Athens retained the ability to receive goods, resources, and reinforcements unimpeded by sea, thanks to its undisputed naval superiority, these annual raids, at first glance, seemed largely ineffective. Nevertheless, the Spartan leadership persistently continued its attacks, pursuing a different, deeper strategic goal. They hoped to lure Athenian troops out from behind their formidable walls. The Spartans were well aware that if the two armies met in a general battle on open ground, the Spartan warriors would almost certainly achieve a triumphant victory. However, Athenian leaders, such as the shrewd Pericles, were also aware of this risk, and during Spartan invasions, the decision was invariably made that the best choice for Athens and its allies was to take refuge behind the reliable city fortifications. Unfortunately for the Athenians, death still managed to penetrate their seemingly impregnable walls. It came not in the form of an enemy raid or a complex spy network, but in the guise of an invisible microbe, lurking in foodstuffs and goods delivered to the city from distant overseas lands. In 430 BC, this terrible plague reached Athens. As the immense population was confined within the city walls, the disease spread with frightening speed, like a wildfire. The situation became so catastrophic that Sparta was forced to postpone its annual invasion to minimize the risk of its warriors contracting this deadly disease. Athens, engulfed in despair, began to plead for peace, attempting to somehow bring under control the epidemic devastating their city. Some inhabitants believed that the Spartans had poisoned the water supplies. Others accused traders from Egypt and Africa of bringing the plague on their ships. Although the Spartans and their allies refused to cease hostilities, they nevertheless decided to keep a respectful distance from Athens and its surrounding territories until the raging disease, the plague, was finally brought under control. They redirected their attention to other strategic objectives, but their efforts did not yield the stunning successes they had initially hoped for. At the very beginning of the Second Peloponnesian War, Sparta and its coalition forces were firmly convinced that they would achieve a quick and decisive victory over the Delian League. But the course of events showed otherwise. The conflict dragged on for many years. In 429 BC, the plague continued to mercilessly consume Athens, weakening its population. However, despite this internal disaster, their powerful naval forces maintained complete dominance at sea, while continuing to effectively punish members of the Peloponnesian League. The Athenians conducted active and daring campaigns in the strategically important Gulf of Corinth with impressive success, demonstrating their undeniable naval power. While these events unfolded at sea and around Athens, Sparta and its allies began a large-scale siege of Plataea. During the Second Peloponnesian War, city sieges became commonplace, leading to the development and application of increasingly brutal and sophisticated tactics aimed at overcoming enemy walls and penetrating fortified settlements. Plataea serves as a vivid example of the ruthlessness and mercilessness resorted to by both sides of the conflict in an effort to break the city's resistance during this grueling war. Spartan troops completely surrounded Plataea, establishing a tight blockade so that neither reinforcements nor vital supplies could enter the besieged city. An imposing earthen mound was erected, designed to allow the soldiers of the Peloponnesian League to cross the high city walls. However, as the Plataeans watched this mound steadily grow higher, they inventively countered the enemy's maneuvers by building up their own walls to maintain a height advantage. In response, the Peloponnesians changed their tactics, resorting to brute force to storm the city. Powerful battering rams crashed thunderously against Plataea's strong walls and massive gates. In turn, the Plataeans hurled down from the walls everything they could find to injure or kill the assaulting troops below: stones, heavy beams, and even chains rained down from the sky, repelling the Peloponnesian forces after each desperate attempt to approach the fortifications. Faced with an insurmountable obstacle in the form of the city's fortifications, the Peloponnesians were forced to resort to a fundamentally different siege strategy. Their warriors withdrew to a safe distance and began constructing their own wooden wall, which completely encompassed the perimeter of the besieged settlement. If a direct attack on Plataea proved impossible, their goal was to subject its inhabitants to agonizing starvation to force them to capitulate. Thus, the Peloponnesians adopted a waiting strategy, patiently anticipating the moment when the Plataeans would be on the verge of complete exhaustion and ready to lay down their arms. In 427 BC, after several grueling months spent under starvation conditions, the predestined day finally arrived when Plataea fell to the might of Sparta and its allies. Such tactical methods were widely employed throughout Greece during this large-scale conflict. Approximately 100 city-states were besieged during the Second Peloponnesian War. Each time a settlement was captured, its inhabitants faced a cruel fate. They were either mercilessly slaughtered by the victors or enslaved, stripped of all freedom. In 428 BC, Sparta launched an aggression against the island state of Lesbos, a key Athenian tribute city gripped by rebellion. However, the Athenians acted preemptively, demonstrating their strategic foresight. They immediately dispatched their fleets and land forces to Lesbos to reinforce control over its administrative center, the city of Mytilene. Upon the arrival of Athenian forces, they were ordered to put to death all men of Mytilene and enslave the remaining population, a measure intended to serve as a deterrent example. Nevertheless, due to the rapid approach of Spartan formations, the decision was made to commute the sentence. Only the instigators of the rebellion were to be executed. As a result, the Delian League successfully held Mytilene and most of Lesbos, effectively pushing the Spartans back to mainland Greece. Between 427 and 425 BC, Athens finally rid itself of the terrible plague that had devastated the city for several years. However, this deliverance came at the cost of irreparable losses. Between 25 and 35% of the entire Athenian population, amounting to 75,000 to 100,000 people, fell victim to the epidemic. Among the dead was the distinguished General Pericles, whose death was a severe blow to the city. Meanwhile, Sparta continued its military campaigns in Attica and the vicinity of Athens, but their advance was extremely slow due to the nature of siege warfare, which required significant resources and time. Simultaneously, the Athenian fleet tirelessly employed its effective hit-and-run tactics along the Peloponnesian coast, delivering swift and devastating blows. In 424 BC, Athens and the Delian League decided to launch a decisive offensive. A large-scale attack on the Sicilian city of Syracuse was planned, to be accompanied by a simultaneous campaign in western Greece. Thanks to its superior fleet, Athens demonstrated significantly faster and more effective movement throughout the region compared to the Peloponnesian land forces. The military situation took a completely different turn, and it now seemed that the Delian League had confidently seized the initiative. The Spartans, realizing the threat, began to show signs of panic. They attempted to consolidate their forces and initiated negotiations with Athens, proposing a new peace treaty. However, the Athenians, emboldened by a string of recent victories, showed no interest in Sparta's peace overtures. Despite this, the Spartan hero Brasidas managed to achieve an important victory in Chalcidice, which provoked a revolt of other cities and villages in the region against the Delian League. In 422 BC, Brasidas and the Athenian leader Cleon met in a decisive battle at Amphipolis, where both distinguished military strategists perished. After Cleon's death, Nicias took his place as leader and managed to persuade Athens to accept the peace treaty proposed by Sparta, bringing an end to the prolonged conflict. In 421 BC, after long and bloody battles, a truce known as the Peace of Nicias was reached between the powerful Peloponnesian and Delian leagues. This pact stipulated 50 years of peaceful coexistence, as well as certain territorial concessions from both sides of the conflict. The primary objective was to restore Greece to the status quo that existed immediately before the outbreak of full-scale hostilities. Unfortunately, not all parties were satisfied with the terms of the agreement. A number of commanders refused to hand over the territories they had captured to the other side, which immediately undermined the fragile peace. In response, Mantinea, Argos, Elis, Corinth, and the Chalcidians formed their own coalition. Meanwhile, Sparta entered into an agreement with Boeotia. The newly elected leader of Athens, Alcibiades, also took action, initiating the formation of an alliance between Athens, Argos, Elis, and Mantinea. Every strategic decision made during the period known as the Peace of Nicias was aimed at strengthening each side's position. Both the Peloponnesian and Delian leagues were well aware of the precariousness of the truce and therefore strategically formed new alliances in anticipation of the impending resumption of armed clashes. The peaceful lull lasted only 6 years out of the 50 for which it was originally intended. This period, from 421 to 415 BC, was characterized not only by the active formation of new coalitions but also by an increase in minor armed clashes. Military actions flared up again throughout Hellas, heralding the arrival of the second, more brutal phase of the conflict. Spartan warriors, having just returned home from a large-scale campaign in Thrace, were forced to confront a new challenge. A revolt broke out in Argos. In 418 BC, Spartan forces under the command of King Agis II launched a decisive attack against the rebels. They inflicted a crushing defeat on Argos and its allies. Consequently, the Spartan warriors, demonstrating ruthlessness, completely annihilated the populations of entire cities and rural settlements that dared to oppose their overwhelming power. Athens, demonstrating its own relentless might, committed similar atrocities on the island of Melos, which had consistently supported Sparta in previous decades. In 415 BC, the Athenian power effectively lit the fuse that ignited a full-scale war when it once again directed its forces to invade Syracuse, located on the island of Sicily. This was no ordinary invasion. Athens amassed colossal forces, including over 100 triremes, 6,000 hoplites, and 1,200 cavalry. They undertook this campaign, staking everything, and failure would inflict a mortal, perhaps even fatal, blow to their ability to win the war. The Athenian general Alcibiades was appointed to lead this massive expedition. Athens recognized the urgent need to control Sicily to replenish and strengthen its fleet. The island's timber reserves would have been sufficient to significantly increase the number of ships and potentially even crush the Peloponnesian League, establishing complete dominance in the waters surrounding Greece. The city of Segesta appealed to Athens for protection against the increasingly aggressive armies of Syracuse, and Alcibiades skillfully used this appeal as a pretext for launching his grand military operation, which required crossing nearly 350 miles or 560 kilometers of the Ionian Sea. However, the night before the Athenian troops departed, Alcibiades was unexpectedly accused of disrespecting the gods. These were likely baseless accusations, put forth by his political enemies in the Athenian government, but it was enough to force Alcibiades to flee. He found refuge in Sparta, where he provided the Spartans with valuable information about the upcoming campaign and the composition of the Athenian forces. Athens, seeking to expand its influence, dispatched significant military contingents under the command of General Nicias with the aim of besieging the strategically important city of Syracuse. Thus began fierce military operations in Sicily and its adjacent maritime areas. These exhausting battles continued for 2 years. However, in 413 BC, Spartan troops led by the experienced General Gylippus arrived to aid the besieged Syracusans and successfully broke through the enemy blockade. The Spartans, employing cunning tactics, lured the Athenian ships into a nearby harbor, where their fleet was completely destroyed. Despite this catastrophic defeat, the Delian League attempted to strengthen its positions around Sicily by dispatching dozens more ships and thousands of warriors, but these efforts proved futile. The Peloponnesian League forces, led by Sparta, inflicted a crushing defeat on the Athenians, forcing them into a disorderly retreat back to Greece. The Athenian forces' attempt to reach friendly territory turned into a tragedy. They were hunted down and completely annihilated by the Peloponnesian League warships. Nicias himself was captured and subsequently executed. As a result of this campaign, approximately 30,000 Athenian soldiers perished, and nearly 2/3 of the Athenian fleet was irrevocably lost. Nevertheless, even after such a massive defeat in Sicily and the irreparable losses sustained by their fleet, Athens demonstrated surprising resilience, continuing the struggle. They initiated a series of sudden raids along the Peloponnesian coast, aiming to weaken the enemy. During this time, Alcibiades continued to provide valuable consultation to Sparta. His deep knowledge of the Delian League's military tactics and awareness of Athens' vulnerabilities made him truly indispensable to the Spartans. It was he who proposed the strategically important decision to build a fort at Decelia to interrupt regular food and other supply lines to the city of Athens. When Sparta's king Agis II moved troops to Decelia and made it his permanent headquarters, it provoked significant changes in the balance of power. City-states of the Delian League began to defect en masse to the Peloponnesian League, notably Chios and Miletus. During this historical period, Sparta, to the surprise of many, made a truly extraordinary decision by seeking a strategic alliance with its long-standing adversary, the powerful Persia. This diplomatic maneuver was successful, and in 412 BC, a pact was officially concluded between the two powers. Under this agreement, the Persian Empire provided Sparta with significant financial resources, enabling the Lacedaemonians to build a powerful naval fleet capable of finally crushing the surviving Athenian squadrons. Although the Delian League had previously suffered devastating losses during the Sicilian expedition, Athenian ships nevertheless continued to operate actively in the waters surrounding the Greek polis, maintaining a threat. The only condition put forth by Persia in exchange for such valuable support was a demand for Sparta to officially recognize its supreme authority over the entire territory of Asia Minor. In an effort to replenish its lost naval forces and increase the number of its combat units, Athens began to levy increasingly burdensome tribute on other member cities of the Delian League. Such a policy inevitably led to growing discontent. Various factions within the League began actively seeking ways to escape comprehensive Athenian control. One of the first clear examples of such resistance was the revolt on Rhodes, whose inhabitants demonstratively shifted their loyalty, defecting to Sparta. Soon, mass revolts began to erupt throughout the Delian League, plunging the Athenian leadership into a state of deep confusion and chaos. The culmination of this internal crisis was the overthrow of democratic rule in Athens and the establishment of an authoritarian regime, which was, however, relatively quickly replaced by a more moderate political group known as the 5000. By 411 BC, the Athenian fleet, demonstrating astonishing resilience, had practically restored its former strength. These naval forces once again began to reign supreme, sowing confusion and destruction along the Peloponnesian coast. During that period, Athenian and Spartan flotillas constantly clashed in fierce naval battles in the waters of Greece, with each side incurring significant losses. In 408 BC, Lysander, an outstanding general eager to prove his superiority against the Athenians, was appointed to the key position of admiral of the Spartan fleet. The turning point came by 405 BC, when Sparta, having received significant financial injections from Persia, managed to build a truly formidable fleet. This naval force comprised approximately 200 triremes, equipped with the most advanced weaponry of the time. Masterfully utilizing his ships, Lysander skillfully maneuvered to lure the Athenians into a decisive confrontation in the waters near Aegospotami. A large-scale naval battle unfolded, resulting in 170 Athenian ships being either captured or completely destroyed. The Spartans did not stop there. They captured 3,000 Athenian soldiers and executed every one of them. This catastrophic defeat deprived Athens not only of a vast number of people but also of critical resources necessary for rebuilding its naval and land forces. Consequently, the city was forced to capitulate, and the once mighty Delian League ceased to exist. In the face of such a crushing collapse, Athens was completely unable to negotiate for peace or put forth any conditions. They were left with no choice but to unconditionally submit to all of Sparta's demands. Among these humiliating terms were the destruction of the famous Long Walls, a symbol of Athenian power and impregnability, a prohibition on building a fleet larger than 12 ships, and the obligation to pay tribute to Sparta. Thus, Sparta finally established itself as the dominant power throughout the region. By securing a decisive victory over the Delian League, which had long been led by Athens, it gained control over most of Greece for many subsequent decades. However, Sparta's insatiable desire for territorial expansion and its claims to dominance in both northern Greece and the extensive lands of Asia Minor inevitably led to a sharp confrontation with Thebes. The culmination of this conflict was the fateful Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, where Sparta suffered a crushing defeat, which proved to be a true catastrophe for them. The military might of the Spartans, once considered invincible, never recovered from this devastating blow, while Thebes progressively detached and annexed new territories that had previously been part of the once powerful Spartan state. This historical event undoubtedly heralded the decline of Sparta.